Today's episode of the podcast features Spain specialist Sarah Jane Evans, MW. In a free-flowing episode, she weaves together her origin story in with her MW journey. We then shift the focus to Spain, first via Sarah's recent book, The Wines of Northern Spain, and then doing a deep dive into Spanish drinking culture, before looking ahead to Sarah's upcoming travels in the region. Enjoy.
My life in wine actually started when I was about 10, when my father and his friends got together and bought what seemed to be an absolutely vast barrel of wine, an enormous thing. I realise now it can obviously only been 200 and something litres, and it was a red wine from, as I learnt later, Burgundy. So this thing came, and the car was taken out of the garage and the barrel was put in and stayed there for about 3 months. And then on a given Saturday, a whole load of adult friends of my parents turned up, and the men put a pipe into the barrel, and then from that siphoned it into bottles and corked it, and then the wives took the labels and made the glue and stuck the labels on. So that was a process. But then I noticed that afterwards they all went, having had something to drink, they all went and lay down on the grass. And I was like, so there's some connection between this liquid and the grass. So my life went on from there. We weren't especially intense wine drinkers. My father also drank beer, and there was gin in the house as well. And then when I was 18, I went to work for 3 months in Spain before I effectively on my gap year. And then I discovered sherry and the wine culture and the food and wine culture. So that was one aspect of it. And the other was that I discovered Spain. But then I went to Cambridge University, and when I read out my essays, which were for the first part of my degree were in classics, so in some Greek architecture or Latin language, then I would be given a glass of Fino sherry as I read out my essay with my tutor, which now seems quite a strange thing, but at that time was perfectly natural. And so actually with my friends as well, we did drink a huge amount of sherry, and yet sherry is a very acquired taste. So sherry and wine were in my life, although students normally typically drink cider and beer, but they passed me completely by, and wine went on being part of my life. I then went into book publishing and subsequently magazine publishing, and then part of that magazine publishing, I was working for BBC Good Food magazine, and I was commissioning Oz Clarke and Gilly Goulden to write about wine, and I thought, crikey, this isn't rocket science. I mean, both of them made it seem super easy. Any fool could do this. And it coincided more or less with the time that the WSET was allowing consumers, non-wine trade people, to study for the different grades. So my husband and I used to go along and do our I can't think what they were called then, but there was an entry level and an advanced and so on. And what we would do was to have effectively, you'd have a geography lesson for an hour, and I'm absolutely terrible on geography, but with wine it suddenly became interesting. And then from the geography lesson we'd have the tasting, and then we would get into the car and drive home, and on the way home we'd have to stop and have a curry on the way home. So for years afterwards I always associated wine tasting curry, and then I did very well in that, and I enjoyed doing it, and suddenly wine became super interesting because of the place as well and the people who made it, all of that, rather than the learning. And so the next thing that happened, having got a scholarship at diploma level, was, well, the Master of Wine was there. But I didn't really know any Masters of Wine. I thought, okay, I might as well sign up and see what happens. And somebody said to me, you realise it's going to be rather hard work? And I was like, that's fine, we can all do hard work. And of course at that point you plunge off a cliff, but at least I'm here to say that a number of years later it is hard work, and if you plunge off the cliff you can swim afterwards. There is a happy ending.
It's really interesting hearing you talk there. With those early experiences with the Burgundy barrel and the visiting Spain have obviously stayed with you. And I think before we sort of dive deeper into Spain, and which is still a huge passion for both of us, I just invite you to talk a bit more about the MW process, because I imagine that there might be people listening who are either considering signing up for the MW process or actually in the midst of it at the moment. So yeah, just share from your point of view, how was it for you to actually go through that and come out the other side, as you say?
The business of being an MW student is an absolutely fascinating one, and things that weren't explained to me when I entered and then became clear afterwards. When you become an MW student, you join a community, and it's not just a community of students who are now in 28, 30 countries around the world, but also the fact that when you want to go anywhere or do anything, you can write to MWs, or you can talk to people in the wine trade, and they'll respect you for the fact that you've got that far within the system. But my first residential week, which was in the Waitrose Partners Centre in Cookham, down by the Thames, in a very, very cold January, was an actually nightmarish experience. I'm interested that I'm here, I'm alive to tell the tale, because on the first morning we had a traditional 12 wine blind tasting against the clock, and we had a Hunter Valley Semillon. So I wrote this nice note about this oaked wine, when the whole point about those Australian Semillons is that they have this wonderful piercing acidity, they have low alcohol, and they don't have any oak at all, but that's how they develop. So I got that completely wrong. And then we had a sweet wine, a Recioto di Soave. Now, I've never had it before, and I have to say I've probably only had Recioto di Soave 3 or 4 times since in my life. And it was the most pulverizing experience ever to be confronted with these wines. But I didn't know where to begin. There was I thinking I got a scholarship from the diploma, and yes, of course I could do it. And the humiliation went on all week. And I think that's something that a few years later, when I became chairman of the Institute, was the most important thing to me, that people could enter the course, or at any level could enjoy wine without that sense of humiliation. There's no point in making people feel small. There is a huge amount to learn, and you never stop learning. But you don't need to be made to feel small about it. And that's, that stretches too to things like going into restaurants. I remember going once when I'd already passed the tasting, but I hadn't passed the theory, because the exam comes in 3 parts, and I'd passed the first part of it. And we went to a restaurant, King's Road, which remained nameless. And I was with my husband, it was my birthday, and our daughters, who were 14 and 16. And for real detail, I'd ordered fish and he'd ordered pork. And I ordered a bottle of Alsace Pinot Noir. And the sommelier, who was French, said to me, "May I suggest to you, madam, that's a poor choice." It's like my children their eyes were popping out of their heads. We'd already had the battle, which maybe you don't have now, about they gave my husband the wine list rather than giving it to me. But and then we had a real to and fro about it. I said to him, "That's absolutely fine. I'm having fish, my husband's having pork. So basically, several times I'd suggested to him that I didn't care what it was like. I just wanted to have it." So he asked me, had I had the producer before? No, that's why I was keen to have it. Had I had the wine before? And eventually he said, "Madam, I suggest you have the Sancerre." And I submitted. So I've never had that wine. But it's that sort of experience that I was so keen to protect other people from. Anyway, that's how it used to be. Things are changing so much. And so I went on studying for the MW, and I simply didn't have an idea about how much I needed to know. And at that time, which was around about the 2000s, the Institute wasn't giving students a lot of help. It still doesn't. It's a self-study program. So, but what didn't help is that I think that my employers, the BBC magazines, BBC Good Food magazine, they were very pleased to support me, but they had absolutely no idea what I'd let myself in for. And they couldn't understand why other people would go and do an MBA and would pay their X £1,000 and 2 years later come out with MBAs. And I was still struggling with this thing that I couldn't pass. You could see that it was beginning to form a question mark in their minds. And that's one thing I'd really advise anyone. If you're going into the MW, you really need to keep reporting back. You need to give them clear ideas of what it's about, especially if you're being funded, as the BBC very kindly did for me. They really need to understand, because in the end, it made me much, much, much better at my work. I had began to get this great global vision of wine, but nevertheless, they had they were employing this person who couldn't seem to pass the exam. So I took the exam, the closed book exam, which is the tasting and the theory, and I failed both parts. And that's a really awful moment. You get this, you get the news, and you don't know how to pick yourself up. And all of us, I think anybody who's an MW student is an achiever. I passed my driving test first time. I'd got a very good degree from Cambridge. We had a happy family and children. What more could I possibly want? We didn't have a Labrador. Maybe that was the only thing a complete house has. And yet I couldn't pass this exam. I just didn't have the insight. And that's one thing we've worked very hard on at the Institute since then. The Education Committee and the Exam Committee worked really hard is on finding ways to get students to understand what they need to know. And the other thing that anybody who's interested in doing the MW now will need to know, if you're thinking about it, there's much more information on the website, but we also don't want you to enter before you're qualified to do so. And that means experience. So, for instance, I went straight in for the diploma, and I just thought, great, I can wander in, I've got the diploma, I must be top dog. I discovered I wasn't. So other people had taken, it took maybe 5 or 10 years from the diploma, and then eventually they'd accrued enough knowledge, and then they could start the course. So I would I would say to many people, don't rush into it. It's the thing, if you think you're the right kind of person to do the MW, no need to rush for it now. But certainly you have to get on the course, you have to have either the level 4 of the diploma or an equivalent wine making qualification, that kind of thing. So there I was, anyway, having taken the exam, having failed it, and then you have to really rediscover how to rebuild yourself and how to redo your study. And then with a lot of assistance from some MWs, I began to understand about doing wine tasting, and then the next year I took the exam and I passed the wine tasting, which was a great surprise because I was sure that as a writer and a journalist I was bound to pass the theory. So this had gone wrong somehow. And actually it took me time to pass the theory. It didn't come easily. And I think that's partly because, and you can see it in the way I talk, I don't talk from beginning to end in starting off with the introductory word and finishing. I like to go round in circles. So similarly, when I write, I like to plunge into the middle of a feature, and then having done the middle, I'd bring you back to the beginning and then go to the end. And that's not the way you write an MW essay. You have to, and especially when I was 16, I took exams in physics, but I didn't have chemistry or maths. So when I had to write an essay about pH or SO2, it wasn't a thing to write about naturally. But you eventually learn that you just need to communicate to the examiner that for 3 good reasons a winemaker needs to know about pH, but this is what pH is, and that's why they need to know about it. And then you write the essay. And the bit that I found super interesting, because it does sound very dry, is that then you need to have been around the world or talked to winemakers, met people at wine fairs, and found out why pH is important to them. And then you don't just say, well, this is the obvious example. You find the example that's different. So you find out people who have different kinds of soils or where the place is different. I mean, that's what I loved about it, and that's an aspect. Maybe as a writer or journalist, I have a very inquiring mind, and I always wanted to know why they did it that way. So that's one word of warning: is if anybody ever gets invited on a press trip with an MW student, think twice about going on it, because the MW student will be the person who's constantly asking why. And it can drive everybody mad when the rest of the bus want to go off and have a beer. There's still somebody there standing talking to the winemaker, taking notes or recording on their smartphone, asking questions why. And it's great for the student, but it can be super irritating for everybody else. So eventually I passed the practical, I got the theory in the end, and when I did both of those, you're like a racehorse. You're really, really on top of the topic. And then I got the result of the theory, which is the second part of the closed book exam I needed to have, when I was in South Africa. And at the time I was in the Jordan vineyard, and with Kathy Jordan going up in the back of a van that she was driving, and the telephone rang from London, and I thought, a public relations person who's trying to get me to come to a lunch, and I can't. We lost the signal. I didn't mind. And the phone rang again, and it was the Institute telling me that I'd passed it. So effectively, I'd got through all that, and it was the most terrific moment altogether, really memorable. Anyway, then all that you have left is what was called the dissertation then, but is a research paper now. But it's basically a report of up to 10,000 words, and you have to find a topic that you really care about. And what was the topic I really cared about? Well, it was going to have to, because you're going to be quietly sitting researching. It's got to be something you enjoy. You can't go into it and write 10,000 words without really loving it. And obviously that was going to be Spain. Spain's always been the place that, as a family, we would go back to 2 or 3 times a year, that I was doing a lot of writing about in different ways. So it was a constant thread in my life. And so it was obviously going to be something Spanish. And I cast around. I thought about doing something that was being talked about, and this was 2005, 2006, was in Rioja. They were beginning to talk about single grape varieties, and Graciano was being talked about. And I thought, well, okay, I could do something on Graciano. There was Contino and Izadi and somebody else. And then it didn't completely set me alight. And then I thought, sherry, that's the thing that goes back to, even being a student, I should do something on sherry. And then that was very interesting. I then had to find a question. So the question in the end that I chose, I went round and round and round. What was I going to do? And nobody had done a dissertation at the Institute on sherry before, despite the fact it's the classical drink for the English wine trade. So I chose the Almacenistas, and these are the people who have stocks of it could be Manzanilla, it could be Fino. They're basically producers who don't commercialise their wines, but what they do is they then sell their wines to the established brands who, when they need extra top-ups, then they'll go to these Almacenistas and get some. But they had just become very well-known because the brand Lustau had issued an excellent range of Almacenista sherries. So I wanted to do a dissertation on them. So I had some discussion with the senior people about this. The comment was it was too journalistic, which as a serious journalist I really objected to. But nobody had written anything about it at all. But then what was quite interesting at that time was that we were still in a time in Jerez, in sherry country, where quite often the bodegas were the small bodegas or the Almacenistas were being managed by people who actually had another business and wanted to use this sherry business to sink their money into, but as a kind of tax dodge, effectively. So nobody really wanted to talk to me, and going around banging on doors wasn't getting me much success, but a few people really opened doors to me, and to whom I'm really immensely grateful still. It was a great thing to do, and it's what I realise now, and I say to other students who are struggling with their research paper, that at the end of it, it does make you an expert in that topic. So you become the person who becomes known for that. So I knew that I knew a lot about sherry, but it wasn't until I really, really went and spent time there that I became that expert, and subsequently it has enabled me to do all sorts of things in my life. So I talk to students who, as there are now, we're in the month of April. We've got March, April. We've got students who are just in a rather intense time with their research papers. Then you just try and say to them, look, you're going to complete it in the next couple of months, and you are then, when you pass, going to be the expert in your area. So stick with it. It's worth doing. That's something, as having been chairman of the Institute, I think is very important. One thing is to go into the exam room and to do those blind tastings and to write the theory answers, but the other one is to do something which is really your own personal work. And if you look around at the topics that are being chosen, there's some super interesting topics. You can't answer the whole lot in 10,000 words, but you can get a good long way. So I'm very excited about the way that aspect was something I really pushed for when I was chairman, has developed. But bringing that long story short, the moment when you pass is absolutely terrific. There are, some special things in your life, and that's one of them, and that makes up, like childbirth, you you more or less forget the pain beforehand. And I think the really good thing about it is we talk constantly about the pass rate. And so people will say, but, so few people pass. And actually, we're really, the pass rate is going up all the time. And partly because we're trying to encourage people not to join until they're likely to get out quickly. We don't want people to spend their time. But it does take, it takes up your friends and family life. I mean, my children were growing up at the time when I was studying, so I never went to see a Harry Potter film. So one of the first things I did after I passed the exam was to sit down and read all the Harry Potter books, because I missed them all. But my husband was an absolute Trojan. Before the exam, the tasting exam, he would, in a couple of weeks before, 2-3 weeks before, he would every morning get up and give me a 12-wine tasting. He'd get the bottles uncorked, he'd mask the bottles with silver paper, and he'd set me out an exam paper, and then he'd go off to work. And then at 8:30 or 9, I would sit down and do a tasting, because a lot of it is practice. And it was very interesting to hear about Gérard Basset, dear departed Gérard Basset. When he became world sommelier, he had physical training, theatrical training. He'd had training for dealing with nerves, all of those kind of things. It's a whole process. You don't just walk into the exam room. You have to confront yourself and challenge yourself. But I think at the end, it gives you all sorts of skills you couldn't possibly have guessed.
Really so interesting to hear you talk like that, and for me it just really shows that really the podcast and what people are listening to now, I think you can get away with telling a story like that, with actually weaving all of those different elements together. And there's such depth, I think, in the answers that you gave there. And I've written down, as I always do, lots of different things, and just I guess the thing that's front of mind for me is what you spoke about at the start there, that sort of the feelings of humiliation and the way that people would potentially try to, I think, take advantage of other people and almost take advantage of the knowledge that they have. And as a relative newcomer to the industry and going to tastings and going out and having conversations with sommeliers, I'm very happy that I don't have any stories like that to report, where you have that very sort of strong pushback against what you want, against what you feel like in the moment. And I'm happy to say I think that's dying out. I will say something though. I will say that I do feel that in the wider general public, maybe not in the trade, I do still think that people are a little bit scared of bringing up the topic of wine, and maybe you've actually helped me understand why they are. I mean, I've asked a lot of people, why do you think there is still that fear about wine, and maybe what it is, and who can speculate all day sort of thing, but maybe what it is that we were coming out of what was maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a much darker time in terms of people being made to feel inferior if they didn't ask for the right wine at the right time, and maybe the actual trade itself and the sommeliers themselves who are sort of have moved away from that, and have sort of moved on now to a more inclusive style, a more communicative style. There's maybe just some sort of echoes of that still felt out there in the wider public, and I just think it will maybe just take time for people to realize that you can approach some of these guys who are fantastic sommeliers, and they won't sort of try to put you down. They'll be happy actually that you're open enough to ask, and they'll sort of hopefully work with you to find something that you'll enjoy. And just the term that I see bandied around so much now, just around deliciousness and just wines that are just fun to have, and I don't think people are, and I think people are less and less they're showing off the knowledge they have, and I think it's something that I pick up as well hearing you talk. I think it's great to have knowledge and great to get through something like the MW, but I think it's even better when you can do so with humility, and when you can wear your knowledge lightly and just be a sort of an energetic draw to people rather than repelling them away from what is, as we all know, a fantastic subject and a very enjoyable experience.
It's very interesting to think about how we, any of us who are at all part of the wine world, and I can say that because having been at a time when I made that crossover from working on what was regarded as a kind of women's food magazine, how could they? I remember going to a tasting in London, and I told them where I came from, and even though I had a very senior post there, they were like, Who's this woman who's come from some kind of food magazine? You know, it might have BBC there, but they were, and then having to spit in public. I mean, we all forget this, but actually, spitting is and then you'd stand next to somebody wonderful like Charles Metcalfe who can do it, from a mile away with a wonderful arc, and you think, I've never even dared to get there, but those kinds of things add to the humiliation and then not having the vocabulary. And I brought with me today a bar of chocolate just because I'm also in the midst of, as I'm a founder member of the Academy of Chocolate, and there we are particularly concerned to promote fine chocolate. It's not confectionery, and it's made from cacao bean. And what's very interesting about that is you can get people, we could go out and collar people now in the street to talk to us about chocolate, and they might say, oh, this is very bitter. And the one I've got here is a 70% with cocoa nibs, which I love the texture. But they would be able to say, well, it tastes to me, or they might say it tastes of, they could say it's burnt caramel, or it tastes of tobacco, or it tastes of, they'll certainly tell me it tastes of chocolate. But if you try and get people to do the same with wine, it's absolutely terrifying. It tastes of, it doesn't even taste of grapes, it tastes of wine. And yet, out in the street, we have an opinion here on tea or coffee, and there are particular brands we'll buy, chocolate, milk, people feel strongly as whether they have full milk or they have skimmed, and all of that. And it's trying to find a way to work with wine. So I remember that my pages on BBC Good Food used to have a little slogan, which I didn't write, and I found it very challenging to work to, which said "No jargon guaranteed," and that's something about you write in several different levels. So when I'm writing for serious wine magazines, I have to find quite serious wine words. But when I'm trying to talk about the joys of even Premier Cru, something wonderful, famous French name. There is a way of talking about it without having to use this excessive language, and also slightly showing off about vintages. That's where I come from. I think of the wine world. I remember where I came from, and I want to have people to have the chance to feel as confident around wine. And certainly you're right to talk about sommeliers. I think the whole thing, in 10 years has changed so much. I have a huge respect for sommelier. They have to work out in a noisy place where they're probably lip reading because it's but they have to work out how much you're prepared to spend. And I think that's the really difficult thing. Do you look at people's shoes and work out what they're prepared to spend? How far do you lead them? I think it's a super subtle job, and it's not something I've ever had to do. So respect to them.
I love that you've already started talking about communication and writing style and the tone, and sitting here as we do with a copy of your book sitting on the table. I think this is really the time where I'd invite you to start to talk about your specialist subjects, your love, and also a love of mine and a love of a lot of my friends, which is Spanish wine. And I don't really want to sort of ask a specific question to sort of tie you down, because I don't feel that's right. But just the thing I would notice about the book, and it's something that stood out for me, was that it was the wines of northern Spain. So maybe that's the sort of point to jump in at. Why northern Spain? And take us sort of through the book and just whatever else that you want to talk about today.
So why the book title? Well, the last book that was written by John Radford, who wrote so much on and so well on every part of Spanish wine and taught me so much. The last book that was he had published was something like about 15, 16 years ago. And since then, wine publishing has gone through problems anyway. But you now come to a stage where, yes, thankfully to the Classic Wine Library, Infinite Ideas, I was able to write a book on Spain. So then you sit down and you say, okay, now how am I going to put this book on Spain together? And then you realise that there is so much happening on Spain that actually you can't just write one book, you have to write two. Mm-hmm. So having written, then you have to work out where the line is going to be drawn. But this one is basically a horizontal line up from just above Madrid to the west, northwest up to Galicia, and then up to the Pyrenees and the Atlantic coast. So, but why is Spain so big now that it needs two books? Well, the answer is, and it's important to go back into history, and Spain's recent history is something that people often forget, that they had a civil war and then they had a dictatorship until the 1970s. So the whole nature of Spanish, of so much of politics and culture and agriculture was frozen. So, and that even went down to vineyard planting and the kinds of things that were planted. And then, of course, the fact that Spanish wine wasn't really a thing to be drunk until much later on. So it was Spain was cut off from the rest of us. And it also meant that the Spanish wine producers, the winemakers and the growers, also didn't travel or couldn't travel so easily. So now we are, thanks to Spain, entering Europe, the new generation, a very exciting country which has had to rediscover itself in Europe since the 1980s in all sorts of fascinating ways. We now have winemakers who've studied abroad. Any young winemaker you talk to now says, well, I worked in New Zealand, California, Chile, somewhere else, and now I'm coming back to work in my own patch of land. And they bring so much with them, and they can see that where there were some very traditional styles of winemaking, there's this huge transformation. So where once indeed I might have been able to write a more formulaic book about Spain, now each one of them is very different people. So let's say if we take a look at Rioja, for instance, there are the three classic sub-regions of Rioja. So that's Rioja Alta, Rioja Alavesa, which is also complicated by the fact it's a political region, which makes it a little bit more difficult. And then what we used to call Rioja Baja, but is now transforming itself into Rioja Oriental. But Rioja has... within that traditional styles, we all learned in our WSET courses about Reserve and Grand Reserve and so on, but actually now there's new people coming in who are able to buy 1 hectare, 2 hectare. They can, maybe they've inherited a bit, or maybe they're hiring it from somebody else or buying in grapes, and they're using different techniques. They're not obliged, if they don't make Reserva wines, they don't have to make it in the standard barrels. They can choose a larger barrel, or they can use concrete eggs or amphoras. There's all sorts of experimentation happening. So even within the most classic region of all, the one that you'll find on every wine list, there's all sorts of excitement to be had. But I do think, and maybe it's something to do with climate change, I'm not sure, many of us are looking for lighter, fresher wines, slightly lower alcohol, and that goes for red wines as well as the white ones. So what's super interesting to me is what's happening in northwest Spain, in Galicia, that you're getting these great varieties that aren't familiar to us, but will soon become so. Mencía, obviously, most famously, but there's Molenzao and all sorts of others. And they have a really nice underlying acidity. Now, I have to make a sort of, I have to step back here and say, maybe I'm being very London here. I'm talking to you in London, and I recognise it's a thing that's very trendy with London sommeliers too, which is for this. They're more like Loire Cabernet Franc. They are much lighter, fresher, crunchier wines. And crunchy, for me, is a very praiseworthy thing. But I think I can see that many consumers who prefer a good alcoholic round Shiraz might balk at crunchy wines. So I can't say that the world is completely converted, but I think what's happening there is super exciting. And then again, along the Atlantic coast, we learnt once about Chacolí as being this thing that you poured from a great height with a bit of white wine with lots of acid and a bit of fizz. And there is a lot of Chacolí still like that, but there's now people in that quite difficult and marginal Atlantic area making Chablis-like wines and making red wines. So there's all, and then in between, if you think about it, visualize it, let's say San Sebastian and Santiago de Compostela, so in between the north coast and the northwest, you have Asturias. Suddenly, in the last couple of years, Asturias has landed on the market with a bang. So we had a very exciting tasting more or less this time last year, when the Institute of Masters of Wine had its, every 4 years they have a symposium, and we had one in Logroño in Rioja. And with my colleague, Master of Wine Pedro Ballesteros, we put together a tasting of rare grape varieties or new producers. And one of those was a producer from Asturias, Bodegas Vidas, and I'm very glad to say they've now got a little bit of distribution in the UK. But also we had wines from La Palma in the Canaries. We had wines from all sorts of other origins which people really didn't know. Sierra de Salamanca is not something that people talk about. And then there's very exciting stuff coming out of Alicante, which has always been known for a different style of wine. So I'm now working on the second book, which is everything below and below, well, from Madrid down, and it's I've got to jam into it Catalonia, the Mediterranean, central Spain, south, and Sherry, and the islands. So it's great doing the research, but and there are very, very exciting wines there. And then obviously within that category I've mentioned, then you have to think about Cava, which is a bit of a complex category at the moment. Spain's traditional method sparkling wine, but there are producers breaking away from it. That's quite a complicated thing to see. There's sherry, where people are beginning down in Jerez to make non-fortified wines again, just how they used to be, and some of them are very good, some of them aren't. It's a bit like the discussion about natural wines. Some of them are really good and some of them are still getting there, but there's so much experimentation in what we think of as a rather traditional classical area. I think too many people in the established wine trade really don't take Spain seriously, and I think that's my I'm a rather avenging angel about this. I'm constantly banging the drum, because you see it, for instance, in terms of auction. When you look at auction prices and things, really it's only Vega Sicilia that sits on the auction list, and partly that's because some of the very best wines produced in small quantities. Alvaro Palacios, who works in Priorat and Rioja, and then with his nephew in Bierzo, his top wines are only produced in small quantities. But what you're going to have to do if you have a top wine is to be like a Bordeaux Chateau or like Vega Sicilia and produce 300,000 bottles. Then you can really establish an extra market in the auction world. But that's something that Spain hasn't still got the confidence of the international marketplace in terms of top wines, and yet, golly, they have outstanding top wines there, giving a huge amount of pleasure and diversity. Spain is the second most mountainous country in Europe. It's got more or less on every side. It's got oceans. You can have it to be as Mediterranean as you want, or as Atlantic, or as just simply continental. It's super exciting.
It's really so amazing for me to hear you talking about Spain, and I realize, having lived there most of 2017, and it's actually where I started the podcast, so I've got a lot of links with Spain. I've still got a lot of friends over there. Hearing you talk about all those different places, it just make me realize how much I miss it as well. So I'm going to be actually going over there a couple of times in May, so really looking forward to that. But yeah, rather than really, asking you to sort of, share more from the book, really, which, I feel like, we should allow people to buy the book and to discover the book for themselves. I'm curious, and this might actually be something that is in the book, but I'm curious just to share with you really my own observations around Spanish culture to wine, and just sort of get your thoughts and ask you to comment. And one of the things that I noticed there is that people were very traditional, I would say, in their drinking choices. I mean, one of the kind of jokes, I guess, or just commonalities, you find that you'd always have the three R's. You'd ask for Rioja, you'd ask for Ribera, or you'd ask for Rueda on the white side. So Ribera del Duero, Rioja for the reds, Rueda for the whites, and that people, you again having mentioned natural wine, that people weren't necessarily open to a more natural wine or a crunchier style. They wanted the classics. They wanted something very familiar. They wanted to know what was in their glass, and they were actually very very set on their Rioja, not their Ribera. It was almost like choosing a football team. You chose your R and you kind of stuck with it. And knowing, I think, more deeply than I do about Spanish drinking culture and the wine production, and having travelled more widely than me for wine, I'm just curious. Is that kind of a Madrid thing? Are there differences out in the regions? Yeah, just your thoughts.
Yes, it's interesting to think about what I drink, or I look forward to drinking when I go to Spain. I probably go about, sometimes it's twice a month, maybe a little bit more, all over the place. And the first thing you do is you think about gin and tonic, because actually, where I'm used to getting a kind of highball glass in the UK with one ice cube, I mean, I exaggerate a bit, but it is a bit, you get those terrific basins with industrial ice, which is quite special. But one thing that I notice particularly, and the thing that I really love about our drinking in the UK in so many places, is that you can drink by the glass. And there are systems now to preserve wines so that I can have one wine, you can have another. If we love each other enough, we can actually share glasses and swap and things like that. We don't mind each other's diseases. But the habit, and it's still so traditional in so many places in Spain, is that you have a bottle. And once you've had a bottle, you're stuck effectively. There's a small number of you, because you might get onto a second bottle, but you're not going to go beyond that. And what I so love is experimentation, going as far as I can with lists. So strangely, as somebody who's a Londoner, there are very many occasions when I will get a really exceptional bottle of wine and I will open it at home and cook something with it, because I'm always, being a typical critical Londoner, I don't let any sommelier hear this, but I'll be like, I'm not sure I want to pay the real price when I go into the restaurant. But in Spain, the people who help me most are the absolute top-end restaurants. So it's worth, if you're doing a trip to Spain, saving up for one of those really exceptional restaurants, which does, the 30-course menu with lots of little dishes and then the wines to match. The iconic version of that is the one you get at Can Roca, where you say to them, most of the guests who go there say, what I'd like to have is world wines, and I say, could I have just Spanish wines? And if you can find Spanish wines and don't know them, all the better. And they bring you glasses, which when my husband was with me on our first visit, and he was like, gosh, they're giving us really small measures here. They're a bit mean. But by the time you've had 17 glasses, it's like, actually, no, it's fine. And we'd shared a bottle of cava before that, so it was fine. And there they take you through the whole culture of wine. They'll take as much, because you're having a very long meal, maybe 3 hours, something like that. They'll talk to you about it. Recently, there's a new restaurant which has just opened in Jerez, which is the first time ever that they have a Michelin-starred restaurant called Lou. He's actually very interested in French wine, but you can say, give me the local wines, and they'll do that, because one of the things you find if you're interested in wine and you're travelling in many areas is that you're very likely to find Rioja sold to you wherever you go. Or if you're lucky, you'll get Ribera del Duero. But, I mean, you're going to get the two, as you mentioned, classical, iconic regions, even though you're maybe in a very good red wine area and the restaurant isn't giving it to you. And then the other thing is they're very unlikely to list the vintages, so that it just tells you the name of the wine, but you don't know which vintage you're getting. So for anybody who has a bit of interest, it's frustrating. There are... one thing I would say about Rioja, there are places where you can still buy very old Rioja, or where sommeliers have got stores of it relatively cheaply, and that's a case for going on holiday with 4 friends or 6 friends rather than just 2 of you, so that you can actually, at prices, well, it's kind of wine you can't find in the UK, or at prices you couldn't afford to pay. They're still available from cellars in Spain, and those are things to find. And you can Google them quite successfully. If you follow conversations online, you'll find out where those places are, or they're listed in the back of my book as well. But lots of people have them. And that's very exciting, to be able to go into a restaurant and see these very old wines. But there are some places, especially around San Sebastian, which is always a good place to go for some exciting eating. They'll give you a menu which is a mixture of maybe a glass of beer with one course, and then it'll be maybe a sherry with another, and then they'll have a white wine with a third. They'll really mix it up. And so I think that's something that's super exciting. Yes, you need to do a little bit of research before you go, and it's worth booking ahead and saving up a bit. But on the other hand, there is that pleasure about just being able to go into any old bar in a local region and having a cheap and cheerful cup of whatever the local wine is, and if it's in Jerez, to finding a good sherry bar. And I have to say that I've been to some quite exciting places in Madrid recently, the 1 or 2 or 3 really wonderful sherry bars, for instance. I talked to a gentleman I met at a party a few months ago in London, and he's a diplomat who used to work in the British Embassy in Madrid in rather dramatic times, and he was reminiscing and saying that they always said to him, you could never drink sherry in Madrid because of the altitude. It's too high. And I haven't checked this out with anyone at all, but I think Madrid has become particularly a very good place to eat and drink, and I think that so it's not just San Sebastian, but it is worth booking up. I think in terms of the quality, top quality food in Spain is outstanding, and the sommeliers who work in those places are really exceptionally good.
So as regular listeners will know, I do like to give the guests the opportunity to, be a little bit speculative at this time. Sort of, look forward, talk about something maybe you're looking forward to, be that something, an event or something you've got sort of scheduled or just, anything else that you might feel is on the horizon.
That's a difficult one. There's so many good things happening, but one thing I would say is more of a wish than anything. I'd love to be back here in 5 years and think that it happened. I'd like to think back to the first ever Congress, which has just been held in Madrid, of the traditional wines of Andalusia. So that's Jerez, Huelva next door to it, Malaga with its sweet wines, and then Montilla, which has really exceptional fine wines. But what's interesting about that is we have watched the decline of all of those categories, huge decline over the last 30 years. It's, and vineyards being pulled up. But now we're just at a turning point. And what I'd like to see, Sherry is working very hard at the moment to get all of us bringing glasses back into our menus, discovering the delights of it. But I'd like to see Montilla being something we can proudly talk about. I remember it once being a rather undervalued thing that you'd buy in a supermarket. But in fact, it's the Montillas which have had 100 points from the top scoring judges. The Montillas are really exceptional wines. And Malaga, which is thought of as a place maybe for tourism, has these, in the hills and mountains above Malaga, there are these amazing sweet wines. So what I'd love to see is the fact that we could start to take Andalusia seriously, not just beaches and sunshine, but actually some very, very exceptional winemakers. Clearly the last 30 years have been a time when everything sold really well, so they didn't really have to think about fighting for the marketplace. Now they're having to think about the best wines from the best soils. They're beginning to talk about terroir, which is something they never talked about, and even the tourism is getting better than ever. So I think my wish and my hope, and maybe I can see a little tinkling of possibilities given that first Congress, is that we'll all be talking about Andalusians' traditional wines in the most confident way in the next few years. what have I got coming up this year? I've got trips to Canada and to Texas and to Hong Kong, and I'm co-chairman of the Decanter World Wine Awards, so that keeps me very busy judging wines from all around the world. And somehow or other I have to complete this book on the south of and centre of Spain. That will be coming. But I'm also going to be, for the first time ever in May, something I'm very excited about, which is a judge at the Copa Jerez, which is the competition where they get chefs from around the world to match wines to sherry. And they have amazing judges doing it. I'm really, really touched to be invited to be in the lineup. And we obviously had this extraordinary selection of food matched to really top sherries in a theatre. I think it's a great dramatic event, and I'm super looking forward to that in May.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was a real pleasure meeting you. As I'm sure you can tell, I really enjoyed reliving a lot of my Spanish experience with her. I'm also super proud to say that I will be there at the Copa Jerez, and I'll be featuring coverage of the event and the symposium on the podcast later in the year. Do please check out Sarah's website and main social media handles below. And of course, I'd love to have you following along with me. I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.